Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Asked and Answered, our 6-week advice column show here on The Financial Diet with me, Chelsea Fagan, your girl, and dear friend, personal finance icon, staple of the genre, Erin Lowry, aka Brooke Millennial.
I just feel like the title just keeps getting bigger and grander every episode.
It's grander.
So exciting.
Anyway, so this is a 6-week series where you guys write in all of your questions about various financial topics, and we clump them into vaguely related categories, and then we answer them. Today we are talking about investing and retirement. One of the more popular subjects, I must say. It was definitely a frequent theme here, both from the actual strategy of investing and the sort of existential dread of, is anyone ever going to retire? What is the world even going to be like when I'm of retirement age? So we'll tackle both. But before we get started, I wanted to start, as always, by saying a huge thank you to our partner on this series, Advisor.com. For those who don't know, Advisor.com is a financial advisory service that offers a flat fee model to their clients, which we really support and endorse here at TFD because it not only means that they work for their clients and not for commissions, but it adds a level of transparency and accessibility to financial advising. I'm someone who's been working with an advisor for years now, and before doing it, I always assumed that you had to be already quite wealthy in order to justify or pay for a financial advisor. Turns out not the case, especially when you're working with a firm like Advisor.com. We've worked with them for years, endorsed them. They're a great company, great advisors, and actually we do a lot of free workshops with them, so keep your eyes peeled for that if you want to just drop in and learn. But if you've ever been thinking about potentially working with a financial advisor, click the link in our description. You can set up a free call with them. You can ask them basically whatever questions you have and just kind of get a vibe off of what it's like to work with a planner. And for being a member of the TFD community, you get an exclusive discount on your first year of working with them. So check it out. It's totally free, no risk involved. Give them a call. All right, let's get into it. Asked and answered. Okay, so we're talking about investing in retirement today. On that note, what's your thoughts on investment? Are you planning to just like model it out to the normal retirement age, or would you like to be financially independent before then?
I mean, who doesn't want to be financially independent before then? Especially if we're qualifying quote unquote normal retirement ages between like 65 and 72, depending on who you're asking, which is pretty late in the game. So I personally, for myself, would love to see financial independence before 50.
Okay. And you're actively working toward that?
Yes.
Nice. What is your big strategy for working toward that?
Actually investing in the stock market, which I know can be scary, and we'll get into it. But, figuring out how to control lifestyle costs as much as possible, figuring out where we would want to live. Spoiler, probably New York, which means that our financial independence number is significantly higher than it would be if we lived almost anywhere else in the country.
You work for yourself?
Yes.
You do a solo 401k?
I do. Well, actually, nice. I do a SEP IRA.
Okay.
For being really technical. But yes, I invest for myself.
Those solo 401ks, no joke, they're great.
Yes, but it makes more sense if you have employees compared to if you're a sole proprietor like myself.
Look at this. All right, so we're going to get into your questions. I also am aiming for financial independence by a similar age, which I'm mostly doing by striking it rich on various enterprises. No, I'm kidding. Investing in the stock market. And not having children. That's a big part of my strategy.
That does save a lot of money.
Famously a cheap lifestyle choice. A 9-pound dog can only cost so much. Okay. Well, let's start with a bleak one. Do you think that the average individual will actually be able to retire in 20 to 30 years' time?
So assuming when we're saying 20 to 30 years' time, that person is around 30 right now. Average, if you are gainfully employed by an employer who offers a match on a 401k, of which you have taken full advantage from the day you started at that company, yeah, it's possible. But average, I think that we really need Social Security to be a viable option for most people to subsidize their monthly cost of living in order for that to be a reality.
And it's not doing well. We are already heading toward a situation where there's not going to be basically anything to draw on by the time you're talking about by 20 to 30 years. Now, I assume, politically speaking, that this is going to become like, there's really two things that you can't touch in American politics: Medicare and Social Security. Lo and behold, people love social programs, especially the old decrepit conservatives who can't stop voting against them. But when you actually touch them, people get very, very angry, and it's one of the few things that will get someone primaried to hell. So Politically speaking, I do have a strong feeling that it's going to be not possible for them to not bail Social Security out to some extent. That being said, I do think politically, if we're talking about playing the averages, you probably want to plan for a scenario where what Social Security is paying out is vastly weaker than today, which is already not enough for most people to live on.
Oh, you absolutely can't live on Social Security today. It's under $2,000 a month for the average person. So that's, for most people, not a livable wage. Even if your house is completely paid off, depending on where you live, like that's still not very much money to work with, especially if you have one big emergency pop up.
Exactly. That being said, I think the other undertone in this question, which we get constantly, is, is the world going to be on fire? Is it going to be a Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome scenario? And to that, I say two things. One, if it's a Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome scenario or like a Quiet Place scenario or any kind of apocalyptic scenario, do you really want to be around? I'll be the first one out on that scenario. Like, get me to the CVS and stock up on... Okay, it's getting a little dark, but anyway, suffice to say, I think that the framing of this existential question that is afraid of a scenario that is light years away logistically from what we currently have, it is a pointless mental exercise, because in those cases, nothing you can do today will really help you effectively plan for that. And you have no idea what that circumstance will be. I mean, obviously, a Mad Max is an extreme scenario, but I mean, for example, there are many people throughout the world who were born into a very stable society and then ended up being refugees, right? So these things are all possible, but the decisions that you make with your day-to-day retirement investing is going to have almost literally nothing to do with the scenario that we're talking about in terms of our worst fears. So I don't think we should really think in those terms. I think what we should think in is in terms of, like we were just saying, a scenario where there's probably still some Social Security. Likely there will be. It will probably be even less sufficient than it is today, which is already not enough. So you need to plan more aggressively, but it's probably more likely than not that you will be able to retire. I think that's just the scenario that you have to plan for. It doesn't mean that we won't end up in some other apocalyptic scenario. It just means that that's not how you should do your financial planning.
This also might not be the most helpful way to frame it, but you are guaranteeing yourself a personal financial apocalypse if you don't do anything to plan for your own retirement. So we basically just have to work within the framework we currently have and hope for the best on a lot of other fronts. But if you just keep putting off contributing to retirement accounts, investing in the stock market, paying down high interest debt, all of these things that set yourself up, then you are putting yourself in a position that you won't either be able to retire or it will be a very uncomfortable lifestyle.
I was actually just yesterday getting coffee with a friend who her parents are separated and neither of them is living their best lives at retirement age. But notably, her mother, who works part-time at a grocery store, is currently in a situation where her husband has been drawing down on their 401k, has been making all kinds of bad decisions that we won't get into too much depth on. But point being, my friend has recently kind of only been made aware of the extent of their financial difficulties. These are people who are both in their mid-60s. And, the crux of our conversation yesterday was she was like, I was really not planning to have to entirely support my mother through retirement, but it looks like I'm going to have to do that because at some point her body's going to give out and she can't work at the grocery store anymore. And she's someone who just already happened to not want children, but she's like, thank God I don't, because I wouldn't have been able to do both. And these are the kind of things that nobody enters life or the workforce thinking that they're going to end up in. Nobody thinks they're going to put their children in that scenario or that they'll be faced with the reality of having to work when they're not really physically able to anymore. But that is the case for millions and millions and millions of Americans. And I think a large part of it is because they don't understand that the numbers that you need to be able to retire are not anywhere close to the number that you get paid every year.
Agreed. The other big thing around that, just a little bit of a tangent, but it does have to do with your own retirement planning, is having conversations with people in your life very early, especially parents and if you're married, in-laws, about what is their financial situation in the future. The number of times that people do get blindsided by needing to care for an aging relative, and that relative might be really reluctant to take help from you. Therefore, they might withhold the information until it's really critical. And if you haven't had the time to set up your own financial life, or you've made family planning decisions, maybe it's about being child free, or if you want children, it could be the difference between having 1 and 2, 2 and 3, if you do have to take care of other people. And I know that's an incredibly hard thing to hear, and a lot of people don't want to receive it. But if you want to also have a comfortable life in the future, and you want to make sure that your children do not also have to be part of this cycle where maybe you are relying on them financially, those are conversations that need to happen early.
Totally. Well, on that note, we have another question that says, what do you recommend for a 30-something only child of parents who have basically no plans for retirement, very little savings, so-so health, and a severe case of Fox News poisoning? They both still work, but I can't imagine that's going to last more than a few years. Anytime I try to broach the subject with them, they totally shut me down, but I'm very aware that their situation is going to make one or both of them my responsibility in a very short amount of time. My husband and I have spoken about this, and he's insistent that I set some serious boundaries around what we will and won't do if they don't at least help themselves, which I think is more than fair, especially given that we're going to have our own child to care for in a few months. Yay! But in practice, I don't really know what this means. What is reasonable to ask of them or to make them do in this moment?
You actually can't ask anything of them ultimately. And what I mean by that is you can set the boundaries that you want to have around, we have X amount that we can give you a month. You can decide whether you want to be directly paying the bill. Perhaps you're going to help subsidize housing costs. Perhaps you're going to help subsidize the grocery bill. But you cannot actually force your parents to talk to you about this. And that is the really hard part. You can keep giving them opportunities, opening up conversation, being a space for them to come and have the discussion. But if they do not want to talk to you, they are adults. They do not have to. The only way you can really take control is in a conservatorship style situation in which you have to take them to court and prove that they are not able to care for themselves, which is really an extreme version that you only really will go to if there's some sort of like dementia or Alzheimer's at play and they like functionally do need to be under a conservatorship. Very extreme case. For most people, what's really hard about this is if you have parents who are reluctant to talk to you about it and you're just left to guess about what the situation is, you probably have a fair amount of context clues that you've been given over the years about how much they may or may not have. You could also decide, here's how much every month, if any, we can put towards supporting our parents. Or you could also think about setting up an emergency fund for your parents. If you have siblings, for people who do, I know if this, in an only child scenario, that's slightly different, but if you do have siblings, you can talk about who can contribute what. Again, referenced earlier, equal is not always fair. So you have to be able to prorate also based on what people can afford and what makes sense for them. And also, you need to have a conversation with your in-laws. Are your husband's parents set up? Are you guys going to also need to be supporting another set of parents? That could be another big factor that comes into play here in a few years.
I'm going to answer this two ways. One is the emotional way, which is I hear you on the Fox News poisoning thing. And these boomers are ruining this country. Because I know if they have that Fox News poisoning, they're like, we don't need to be paying for blah. So there's a big part of me deep in my soul that says, let those MFers rot. They voted for this. This is what they want. This is what they want to impose on the rest of the country. Enjoy, baby. Enjoy. You want no social services? Here's what that looks like. Enjoy working until the second you die. So I would, if I were you, I would probably have some feelings to work out about this. Maybe it couldn't hurt to see a therapist because it is a deeply unfair situation to put you in. Also, the fact that you can't even talk to them about it without them completely shutting down, and yet you know that it's still going to fall to you even though they won't be adults and have any kind of conversation about this. Sounds like you're also about to have a kid in a few months. Now, that is a pretty bargaining chip because conservative boomers might hate 99.9% of the world, but they do love their grandchildren usually and really want to be a part of their lives. I would, if I were you, be like, listen, you want unfettered access to this child? We got to sit down and go over your bank statements because I am not going to be living in perpetual fear that I won't be able to afford my child's needs because I have two, let's be clear, these Fox News boomers are also children. They're just older physically, but they are also children emotionally. And I'm going to have these other adult children to take care of. So we need to set some serious ground rules. I think personally, so much of our country will not get better until we have some demographic shifts that need to take place. Let's just say it that way. But in the meantime, I do think that what they're doing to you and asking of you and of your husband, if I'm your husband, I'm like, screw these assholes. Like, they can fend for themselves, especially if they won't even sit down and have a conversation with you. I would highly recommend, whether it is a financial therapist, a counselor, someone, I would recommend talking to a neutral third party in this scenario, because you're going to have to put up some ground rules that, no one likes being told what to do less than these decrepit, OAN boomers. And you're going to have to do that. And that's probably going to cause some strife. And you need to remain strong and also, again, work through the fact that they're putting you in a really unfair position. If it's any consolation, this is happening every day around the country. And, at some point, these millennial and Gen X kids are going to have to lay down the law.
What is a hard part, though, about the child portion is if you need or expect your parents to provide any level of childcare for you, that really does complicate the situation. And so thinking about if that was an expectation that you and your husband had, what does it look like for you both financially, practically, and emotionally for that to no longer be an option, particularly if you're drawing really firm boundaries? Alternatively, you could have conversations around if they are the childcare option and they're not really willing to accept money from you any other way, could you pay for them to be childcare in order to make it feel better to them to be accepting money from you? And the problem, though, I would say with that is if you feel that they don't handle their money well, then you really have no control over how they're spending that money that you are using to fund the childcare portion. So for people who want to help their parents but feel that their parents aren't good at handling their money, it does make a lot of sense for you to take on very specific bills and pay them directly so that you're not dealing with how your parents might be handling the money.
I mean, on that child care front, though, if in your words, they have a severe case of Fox News brain poisoning, you want a slow drip of that 40 hours a week into your children's brain? Because I know I wouldn't. Something to consider. Would you hire a nanny who was like, Haitians are eating dogs in, the Midwest or whatever was said at that debate? I don't know that I would necessarily want that raising my child. But listen, I think at the end of the day, millennials are at an existential crisis with their boomer parents all across this country. I know, I would say of all my friends in day-to-day life, about half of them are dealing with a situation somewhat similar to this. And I think, the tough part is at some point, these boomers are they F-A'd quite a bit. Gonna need to start FOing, I find. And I think setting some boundaries is really a huge part of that. And I agree that if they're not handling their money well to begin with, even paying them for something isn't really a great option because they could just fritter it away and be back in the same place. Godspeed. But again, I think you should really talk to someone.
I would also look into the social services options in your area, just so you know, as a almost financial safety net for yourself, what could even be available to your parents. And they might be very resistant to going on any sort of program, but just so you know what the options are, particularly if it does get really dire for them.
In my experience, the most anti-social services boomers have no problem taking it themselves. I have retirement accounts from my current and past job. Should I combine them?
Yes.
Asked and answered.
Really that simple. However, a couple of things to consider. Generally, I would say combine the thing that makes it the most simple for you in the future instead of having to go back and track down 5, 6, 7, 8 401ks. Just keep bringing them along with you. However, that doesn't mean that you have to roll your old employer 401k into your new employer 401k. You could just roll all previous 401ks into an IRA that you control that's not then commingled with your new employer. Depends on what the investment options are with your new employer, what the fees are. It just might make more sense to open up an IRA and then every time you leave a job, roll it on over. It is so easy to roll over a 401k into an IRA because the brokerages want to make it nice and simple for you. So if you're intimidated by it, honestly, get on the phone and actually talk to someone at a brokerage firm where you want to roll it over. But it is pretty flawless, pretty simple. And then you don't have to go hunting for them in the future when you're retiring.
Asked and answered. Why should I invest when inflation's just going to eat up all of the benefits I see from it?
Well, if you don't invest and you just keep your money in cash, you're then kind of in the red if you think about it, because even if you have your money into a high yield savings account, as those interest rates keep dropping, your money is certainly not keeping pace with inflation, where at least with investing, hopefully you're beating out inflation, certainly in the long run, but even in the short run, you're still probably coming out a few percentage points ahead unless we're in a down market. But again, then over the course of the decades that you should be investing, you will definitely come out ahead.
Yes. I mean, investing, again, we have over 150 years of market data. You can go look back at it and see that over a sufficient period of time, it basically always edges out inflation. And to your point, it's the only alternative to just, stockpiling your money. And I know that sometimes high yield savings accounts can have good interest, but it's never enough long term to beat inflation. I have a couple of questions regarding retirement and changing jobs. The good news for me is that I work for a state government with good retirement benefits. The bad news is that the state is Texas. Right now, I have almost 6 years of state service. I need 10 to get the full benefits, including the pension and health insurance. The working situation has been weird and getting worse since Trump got elected. I've thought about moving states. I've thought about leaving for the private sector. I'm a data analyst, so I feel pretty confident that my skills could transfer to another industry, but I like working in public health where I feel like I'm helping people. Also, my whole life is in Texas, and while I get why people are leaving the state, it scares me to do that. I'd like to stick it out to get the benefits, but should I? I could buy back 2 years of state service from a cash out I did after I worked for a university. It would cost me about $8,000, and that money would then be part of my retirement, so I'd have 8 years of state service. I have about $30,000 saved right now, so while it's a lot of money, I could cover it. Does this make sense to do? What should I consider when thinking about moving states or industries? I hope this makes sense. I know that it was rambly.
Given the volatility of positions we once believed to be very steady, this is a hard question to answer.
I think if you have a good job, keep it. When considering the potential benefits, because listen, if you're 2 years away from a pension, for example, it is a very, very small number of people from our generation who could even dream of accessing that kind of retirement security. I think that the risks of totally upending that, things would have to be pretty dire in order to say, okay, I'm not even going to wait it out 2 years. I'm just going to up and go, even though I have this great position that's leading me into a wonderful retirement package. Only you can answer whether or not Texas is at that level of dire right now. For example, are you a trans person? Are you an undocumented immigrant? Which I assume you're not. A woman. But here's the real thing, and I hate to get this nitty gritty about it, but you got $30,000 in the bank. If you were a woman and things got real tough overnight, you have more options than the vast majority of women in Texas. Let's start there. We have to always balance protecting ourselves socially, politically, and not really disrupting ourselves financially. This is a choice that many people face for all different kinds of reasons. And I do understand that Texas is not a place, it's not a place that I would want to live at this time. But again, when you're in that position of heading toward that kind of financial stability, think about all of the other benefits that will accord you, especially in a place like Texas, but also generally. And lastly, $30,000 in the bank, it's not enough to retire on, of course, but it's certainly not nothing. Having that cash, also let's get some of that invested, but having that liquid, if you need it, that means that you have the ability, because let's say in some way that we can't necessarily predict, shit gets really real in Texas in the next 6 months. You have more than enough money to move out of the state and be okay for a little while. So I would not disrupt things if I were you.
A few things though to think through on this front. So when you say 2 years away, that is inferring that we think the buyout is a good idea, or buyback, I should say, not buyout. So yes, going to year 8 and then buying back 2 years of service, so you hit that year 10, making sure that that is fully locked, that you can access your pension. However, with pensions, typically, even at the state and federal level, there comes with a certain level of you vested, but if you leave early, it's going to significantly reduce your actual annual benefit. So making sure that you understand that if you stay in until year 10, but then leave, what is your actual annual payment going to be? Because it's probably going to be reduced by, I'm betting, at least 40 to 60% compared to if you stayed there till you were, sometimes it's age-based, sometimes it's service-based, so maybe it's 25 years, or maybe it's until you are 55, or a mix of the two. The other thing to consider is who is backing your pension. Where is that money coming from? Because the number of pensions that have gone down around this country because they were guaranteed maybe by a state and then the state went bankrupt or something happened with mismanagement of the pension is actually scarily high. So making sure that you actually understand how viable is the longevity of the pension fund. Do you actually feel really good that, hey, in the future, this pension actually will be solvent and will be able to pay me out? And then on top of all of that, you should still be investing for your retirement outside of your pension in the future. So not saying in the next couple of years you can get to year 10, but once you get there, it is something to consider that you should diversify your retirement benefit options. They should not be exclusively tied to a pension. And this is for anybody who has access to a pension or is married to someone with access to a pension. You need to really be doing more than just relying on that particular sum. You want to diversify your options just like any other form of investing.
Very true. But I will reiterate, it's so rare these days to have the extra cushion of a pension. I think the benefits would have to greatly outweigh that to consider the switch now prematurely.
And you might be vesting in healthcare benefits and retire, which is another huge financial win for you.
Totally. I feel you on Texas, though. Man, these red states.
Oh, just another thing to add, though. If you are going to leave Texas, you don't have state income tax there. Your salary is going to look significantly different if you move to a state that does charge state income tax. So making sure that you do those calculations in the salary that you would need to receive if you move.
How do I invest without investing in things that are killing the planet and or people?
This is a bit of a complicated one because you're almost complicit regardless of how you invest. But there are ESG funds, environmental, social, and governance funds. There's SRI funds, which are social responsibility funds. There's impact investing. There are ways to look at funds and investments that can then kind of isolate out either things that you don't want or that are just very specific for things that you do want. So if you feel either ethically or religiously that there are certain things you don't want to invest into, there are funds that can make sure that those things are excluded. However, if you want to kind of go really macro about it, if you're still investing and you're still going through a brokerage or whatever that still invests in those things in other ways, you're technically still part of the ecosystem, but your actual money doesn't need to be tied up in things that you dislike. Now, I will say generally, if you take investing advice from the internet and you hear things like invest in total stock market index funds and S&P 500 index funds, I guarantee you that has your money in things that you probably find unsavory. So it just takes a little bit more research.
I made a whole video about this, which I'm not going to repeat. I'll link it in the description. But you would be infinitely better off just investing in the S&P 500 and then using some of your time, energy, and resources to get in any way involved in politics at any level, because first of all, keeping yourself broke is not going to help anyone, and not investing in the stock market is basically going to ensure that you'll never be able to retire. And then second, and kind of more importantly, we're in a situation now where like there's almost go through an average day in an American's life, chances are they interacted at a given point a dozen times a day with companies, organizations, et cetera, that have really bad business practices, whether it's in the production of materials, the treatment of staff, labor, all of those kind of things, environmental impact, whatever the case is. I've never been a fan of the form of activism that mostly just involves consumer choices. Not because I don't think you can do both. If you can do both, great. But in the case of investing, it is so hard to effectively ensure, because even a lot of those like ESG, they're not that perfect when you look into them. It is so hard to invest in a way that does not destroy the benefits of investing by radically reducing the compound interest that you'll probably see from it, and or, have some serious ethical concerns. Like it's very difficult to square that circle, as opposed to like when you're talking about buying a shirt, you have a very clear choice of you could buy this from Shein or you could buy it from a local secondhand store or whatever the case may be. You don't have that same binary. But even in the case where you do have a binary, I still think that thinking about our impact on the world in terms of our consumer choices, and there's studies that show this, right? I think it sort of lets people off the hook a little bit in terms of their actual political involvement. And because at the end of the day, whether or not one person, using flying as an example, for example, a lot of people choose not to fly for an increasing number of people, maybe not a lot, but an increasing number of people who could fly choose not to for the environmental impact. Between now and 2030, commercial flights are set to about double because more and more people are able to fly and choosing to fly. And that's, for a lot of reasons. Part of it just the world is getting a little better off. But I say all of this to say that if what the goal is to reduce the environmental impact of flying or to reduce the number of flights or any of those things, that's a policy change. That's almost entirely dependent on government regulation. And that's a question of politics. And you buying or not buying a ticket, do whatever you want for your own personal choices. But I think when it comes to our financial planning, this hyper focus on personal choices, whereas in most cases, it just sort of doesn't really make much of a difference. In this case, it actually really risks hurting you financially. And on top of that, it's not going to affect the S&P 500. So ask yourself, if you feel very concerned about the system we live in and our lack of good choices, start small. Who's your city comptroller? Who's in the primary for mayor in your election, in your local election? Who's your senator? Who's your congressperson? Who are all of these people? What do they stand for? Get involved in some way to actually sort of work towards changing the parameters than obsessing over making the best choice within really bad parameters.
The other thing I will though add, if you want a really tangible way to impact with the stock market, one of the options with impact investing is actually less to do with you, the individual investor, and looking more at institutional investing. So if you have any sort of connection to whether it's a big university or a company that has a major endowment that maybe has a big portion of that invested in something that you and many who went there, because you need ground support for this, find unethical or immoral, trying to create policy change really within that institution to get them to divest from things that you think are immoral, unethical, etc. That actually can really help move the needle on something with which you are associated, and honestly sometimes have ripple effects as well. We have seen historically success in that over the decades, so just another thing to consider.
I'm a bit of a cynic when it comes to a lot of these systems, because I think the reality is most of these things historically don't change until there is essentially a political or economic sort of force changing it. For example, people are always up in my comments getting angry at me for not being vegan. I'm not going down this road with you guys. Comment away. I will not be going down this road with you guys. But the reality is, when it comes to things like more and more people making the switch to veganism, that's going to come when a variety of market forces kind of coalesce to make that an economically better choice, not only for the companies producing it, but for the consumers buying it. I think we're not that far away from it, by the way, with things like lab-grown meat and, imitation meat and things like that. I think we've come very far and will continue to go very far, and eventually it will become a sort of economic no-brainer. Similar to things like with electric vehicles and all of these other things. Yes, policy can have a huge impact, but also economically, it's about what becomes more viable, again, for both the producer and the consumer. Similarly with investing, as you kind of pointed out, it's a little game of a whack-a-mole in terms of, if let's say you're very, very concerned with things that, so one of them might be like gender parity on the executive board, as an example. You could have a company that you're investing in that does great in that, but then it doesn't do great in, environmental impact or whatever the case may be. It's very, very difficult to have sort of universality and ethics with these big companies. But overall, it's kind of about when the market is going to dictate that an alternative is better. That's the way it's always gone when you look historically at basically any of these big macro ethical issues. And again, sometimes it's a combination. Like we got rid of, we instated child labor laws, not because we didn't love sending kids up chimneys, but because we politically mandated it. So it is both, but generally it's a lot of market forces. And I think that a lot of people who are very concerned with their ethical impact through consumption need to, at some level, make peace with this, because you will drive yourself crazy trying to be perfect, while the vast majority of the world, and certainly the profit-seeking entities within it, literally do not care whatsoever. They're just looking at numbers on a chart, whether it's the numbers on a chart in a shareholders meeting or the numbers on a home budget when they're making their decisions about where to buy something.
Yeah. Asked and answered.
Asked and answered. Period. So we'll finish it up by, so a bunch of people asked some version of how do I get started investing?
The very first way I would like you to get started with investing is if you are traditionally employed and have an employer-matched 401k or 403b or some similar retirement vehicle. That is the easiest way to get started. If you are feeling overwhelmed because you signed up and then you get into a portal that asks you to figure out how to invest your money and there's all these big terms on the screen and you don't know what any of them means, look for something called a target date fund. This is not prescriptive investing advice. This is just if you want to get started and you don't know how, this is specific for retirement investing. So whether you have set up your own IRA, solo 401k, SEP IRA because you are self-employed, or you are traditionally employed with a 401k, a target date fund, all it does is it invest your money so that it's tied to a year approximately you're going to retire. Let's say it is target date fund 2050. The younger you are, the more aggressive it invests you, then more moderate, then more conservative as you approach retirement age. It is a one-size-fits-all solution to something that really actually should be curated specifically to you, but it's a way to get started. If you put your money in a target date fund, it doesn't have to stay there forever. It just makes sure that the dollars are actually invested and not sitting tragically in savings. You want to make sure that the money you are putting into any sort of retirement fund is actually being invested because unfortunately, we use the language save for retirement, which is a misnomer. You need to be investing for retirement. And if you're watching this and thinking, oh dear God, is my money invested or not? Log into your 401k and check to make sure that your money isn't all sitting in something either called a cash settlement fund or a money market fund. If the money hasn't really moved at all over the last year or two, that's sitting in cash. You can also call and ask somebody. So make sure your money is actually invested. If you've done all of that and you're investing for retirement and you've paid off all of your high interest rate debt and you're ready to do more, then you could also open up what's called a taxable brokerage, which basically just means you don't get a tax benefit, but you're also investing. And you can do that at any big traditional, investing firm, your Fidelities, your Vanguards, your Charles Schwabs, and more, or you could look at a robo-advisor, or you could look at an investing app. Although if you're going to do that third one, make sure you understand the fees, make sure that you are not swayed into maybe speculative assets like cryptocurrency, or investing on margin, or doing any of these things that the basic rookie investor probably shouldn't be dabbling in.
Or any investor. Listen, so when you have both the retirement accounts and the taxable brokerages, often you will be using two different platforms for them because you just get whatever your company does and then you can pick your own. So I've used a few of them. This is completely unsolicited, but I would it's actually not that positive. So of course it's unsolicited. We use Vanguard for our taxable. I personally find it to be a much more complicated user experience. Do you use Vanguard?
Yeah, I do. And
I find Fidelity,
their UX could use a tweak.
Their UX is fighting for its life. My husband really responds to it. I don't know why. It sort of lights up his brain in a way that it doesn't mine. I personally find Fidelity has a slightly easier user experience. That's just my take. But try to play around on the websites a little bit, get a feel for what you actually feel like you understand and can use easily. Because a lot of this feels very intimidating and confusing, which is why, for example, a lot of people will start with a robo-advisor because it really takes basically all of the navigation and guesswork out of it. You do pay higher fees generally as a result, but there's just so much less for you to actually do and navigate. I was using a robo-advisor for the longest when I was getting started, and then my husband was like, no, enough of this. We're putting this into a self-managed account. But again, make sure that it's something that you can understand and use, because every time I look at that Vanguard portal, my mind just goes completely blank.
Also, just be aware that different companies might use different names for something like a target date fund. That's the industry term. You might hear all-in-one fund, life cycle fund. Just know that if what you're looking for is a target date fund, you could always call customer service, explain what you're looking for, and they can help you find the right thing. And then in terms of age of retirement, if you're looking to fire and retire early or just hit an early retirement year, don't make your target date fund to the year you turn like 50, because then it'll go way too conservative way early. You want that year to be more correlated with 65 or 70, a more traditional retirement age. One big mistake people make with retirement investing across the board is getting too conservative too early with their money. So just something to think about, and another reason it's good to have a third-party financial advisor.
True. We were, there's nothing better than logging on with that man and him being like, this is what I think, blah, 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 blah. Now, my husband is he's into the gamification of money. He's very into it. So he's always like, I don't know how I feel about this. I don't know that I agree necessarily. And he's like going tit for tat with this man, which I could not be bothered to do. I'm not trying to like get 0.03% more by doing something slightly differently. That's really not the life that I'm put on this earth to live, but it is really nice to have an extra person who can help guide these decisions, especially when markets are really scary, like I think what's going to be the next 4 years, honestly.
If you are traditionally employed, depending on who your employer uses to host your 401k, a lot of them do actually offer some sort of free consultation or access to somebody for free, especially when you're just getting started, or your employer might bring somebody in-house once a year or on a Zoom, what have you. So really keep your eyes open for those opportunities and take full advantage of it, because it is really helpful to just have somebody to talk to. And those people can also be the ones that are like, hey babe, your money is sitting all in cash. That's a little bit less likely to happen these days thanks to certain policies that we actually now have in place. Yay, when it comes to retirement investing. But if you've had your account for a few years, just make sure you double check.
Always a reminder, though, when it comes to anything that your employer is providing you, HR works for the company and not for you. Like, for example, when you're maybe looking at certain financial products and things like that, just make sure that the benefits are oriented toward you and not toward the company. And just remember to double check everything because, again, HR is there to work for the company. They are not your friends.
And you want to make sure that your retirement money is not exclusively tied up in your company. So if you are investing, you don't want all of the money invested in your company's stock. Even if you also get stock as a benefit of your job, you want to make sure to be diversifying. Because if anything were to happen to the company, that's your salary and your whole investment portfolio kind of going up in smoke all at once.
The number of people, because Millennials, we had a bit of a boom of the startup, stock, get stock in our, shitty startup economy. The number of people I know personally who have zeroed out on these companies and never seen a dime, were always promised more, were always promised big things, and never materialized. The kernels never popped. And now they're kind of starting over again in their 30s on retirement.
Which, if you're starting in your 30s, it's okay. It's doable.
But they wouldn't have if they weren't being sold a dream.
Yeah, absolutely. And you always, like Chelsea mentioned, be a little bit skeptical, especially when it comes to HR and those kind of big promises.
Asked and answered.
Just going to tag everything.
Now scram! Now scram! All right, guys. That was our little chat on investing and retiring. We will see you back here next week for an all-new episode of
Asked and Answered.